May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I once had a boss who I used to refer to as Captain Roadblock. Every idea, every suggestion, every single thought that I communicated with him, it seemed was always met with a litany of problems and excuses and reasons why it wouldn't work. So needless to say, Captain Roadblock created a lot of frustration for me in my job. So in today's gospel story, Peter is Captain Roadblock to Jesus. But how? The disciples were beginning to believe that Jesus was the Messiah. But to them, that meant that Jesus was a conquering Messiah, a warrior king who would sweep the Romans from Palestine and lead Israel to power. And the problem with this viewpoint is this. Had the disciples gone out and preached Jesus as a conquering Messiah, I don't know if you remember the last sentence from last week's gospel. Jesus had restricted them from doing this. He had said, he had told them not to go out and tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Do you remember that from last week? You probably do, Tom, I'm sure. Again, had the disciples gone out and preached Jesus as the conquering Messiah, the disciples would simply have started a hopeless revolution against Rome and caused a lot of unnecessary bloodshed, which was something that obviously Jesus did not want to happen. So when Jesus speaks to the disciples about going to Jerusalem and facing up to what will certainly be his own execution, Peter catches hold of Jesus and says, "This must never be." Peter thought he was, in effect, preventing Jesus' suicide. And I think it's safe to say that we would react in the same way. If you had somebody you knew, a friend of yours, who said, "Well, I'm going to go to this very dangerous location where I will probably die," I think it's safe to say that we would all try to prevent that from happening, wouldn't we? I would, I'm sure. But Jesus reacts differently. What comes next is what's known as the Great Rebuke. Jesus is angry with Peter for trying to prevent what he intends to do. And so Jesus states sternly, "Get behind me, Satan." Tom just read it. "Get behind me, Satan." Or to use my terminology, "Get behind me, Captain Roadblock." Which, by the way, I'm glad Matthew went with Satan instead of Captain Roadblock. It certainly feels a little more biblical, I think. But even Jesus says, "You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Not on divine things, but on human things. And aren't we all guilty of that sometimes? I feel like I am constantly distracted from the spiritual part of my life by human things. Like Peter, I don't want anyone to die, although I believe in everlasting life. If one of my friends talked openly about intending to die, I am sure that I would likewise try to prevent it. In this way, I too would be guilty of placing roadblocks before Jesus. Peter is, if nothing else, very human, isn't he? Now, a word about Jesus' use of the word Satan. By Satan, Jesus is not talking about Peter being possessed. He's not suggesting that Peter needs an exorcism or something like that. Instead, he means any thought or temptation that takes us away from the path of God, which is what Peter is trying to do by preventing the crucifixion. The human things that Jesus spoke of, that's the Satan that he's referring to. There was an early Christian theologian who lived in the early 200s by the name of Origen. Origen was the first guy who suggested that when Jesus said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," He meant that Peter was leading Jesus, not following him. In this way, Jesus is not banishing Peter from him like we would the devil. Get away from me, devil. But inviting Peter to follow Christ's teachings. Get behind me, he says. Even if it means that Christ will have to die, something that again would be difficult for any of us to face. And of course, we remember how much trouble Peter had at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, ultimately denying 3 times that he even knew Jesus. And so, although the use of the word Satan is definitely extreme, we should take note of the fact that Jesus is not suggesting that Peter is literally the devil, but rather that he is getting ahead of Jesus and preventing Jesus from doing what he needs to do. Peter is laying a roadblock. Now, this is a problem I face every year when I go back to school, which I am about to do. As most of you know, I'm a school teacher. And every once in a while, I will encounter students who disrupt the classroom environment and prevent others from learning properly in school. Although I'm sure Will and Ben never do this, right? But present company is excluded, of course. But there are those who will do this, who will lay roadblocks in the classroom. And I do stop short of calling these students Satan. But I definitely rebuke their interference. But the rebuke here is not the ultimate point of this particular gospel story. Jesus goes on to lay down a challenge before those who wish to follow Christ. The challenge has 3 parts, and Christ repeats this challenge several times throughout the New Testament. And you can find the challenge, coincidentally, located on the cover of today's bulletin. If any want to become my followers, says Jesus, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. First, Jesus says we must deny ourselves. Denying ourselves means thinking like a Christian or thinking of others first. It does not mean simply giving up chocolate for a week. In social situations, I have a tendency to try to make connections with other people to myself. It's something I've noticed that I do, and I wish I wouldn't do it. But I have a tendency in social situations not to deny myself, but to connect people to myself. I always admire people who seem to just naturally have an interest in others. Just automatically. Just want to get to know a new person exclusive of how they relate to that person. I admire that. So that's what Jesus means by denying ourselves. Denying our selfishness is what he's talking about. Second, Jesus says we must take up the cross. In a word, taking up the cross means sacrifice. Sacrificing our time, our treasure, and our talent are all required in order to follow Jesus. How do the words sacrifice and convenient get along? The answer is, of course, they don't. Sacrifice comes in many forms. Missing church to teach Sunday school. Giving up one's weeknights to do the business of church. Or contributing money to the Hurricane Harvey Relief Fund when you are planning on paying off your car. These are good examples of taking up the cross. I like the way Luke puts it in his gospel. Let him take up the cross daily, says Luke. And finally, we must follow Jesus. We must follow his teachings and lead our lives his way. If we are truly followers of Christ, we must, like Peter, get behind Jesus. We must walk in his footsteps, listen to his words, and love and be loved by him. For there is no path in front of Jesus that leads to our salvation. It is only through a constant following of Christ in thought, word, and deed that will bring us, as it did him, to eternal life. May it always be thus, and may we be blessed as we follow the road Jesus walks. Amen.